Well, good morning. Welcome to the Verse by Verse podcast. Hope you're having a great day so far. Thank you for joining us again as we kind of continue our read through and look through the Gospel of Mark. Noah, you having a good morning?
Good morning.
Yes. Well, we're going to pick up the reading today in Mark chapter 7, verse 14, and we're going to read down through verse 23.
And after he called the crowd to him again, he began saying to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. And if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." And when they had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples were asking him about the parable. And he said to them, "Are you lacking in understanding in this way as well? Do you not perceive that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, but because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and goes to the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he was saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, sexual immoralities, thefts, murders, adulteries, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man."
Well, I think there's a number of interesting observations that we can make about this text. But before we address the text that you just read, just remind ourselves in chapter 7, verses 1 through 13, Jesus was confronting the traditions of the Pharisees and how they perceived someone was right before God, how they were clean, how they were not defiled. And Jesus continues that line of thought when he addresses the crowd that assembled together. So I want us to notice in verse 14, he called the crowds to him. The crowds didn't seek him out. He drew their attention to himself, saying, "I need you to know this and know this important distinction." And when they came together, he kind of made a pronounced statement, a kind of confusing statement. Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him. But the things which proceed out of the man are what defile him. And it's kind of like a mic drop moment. He just kind of throws that out there, doesn't explain it, and walks away with this challenge. If anyone has ears, let him hear. That's kind of inserted. Many of the translations do not have that, but it's the challenge to the audience. Hey, let's see if you all can puzzle this out. Mm-hmm. If you have a heart, an attitude, a disposition toward God, you're going to consider these words and they're going to challenge you.
Jesus says that in a lot of other places too, so it's not crazy to think he would.
Yeah. But the other thing I just want to kind of note, it doesn't really change anything about it. He calls this a parable. I find that kind of interesting. Yeah. Most of the time when we think of a parable, we think about a story that Jesus tells that's used as a means of comparison or contrast to something heavenly, something spiritual. Here, he just makes a statement, yet Mark calls this a parable. And I think that's maybe intentional because really the parable was probably what his disciples did in verses 1 through 13. And now he's commenting about them plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. Maybe a thought. I may be missing the point, but I find it kind of interesting there. The other just kind of interesting thing before we jump into its meaning is the conclusion that is drawn in verse 19, that Jesus' statement here is declaring all foods clean. As far as I know in the Gospels, that's really the first declaration that Jesus is setting aside all these dietary laws. And yet it is still lost on his disciples because when we get to Acts chapter 10, Acts chapter 9 and 10, Peter still had to learn this lesson to some degree. But here is this first declaration. So what does this mean and what does it mean to us? I think at its heart, there's a lot of confusing statements here about, well, what does it mean if we take something in that doesn't defile us because it just goes straight to the stomach and out to the sewer, but what comes out of man? I think what he's kind of getting at is one of the ideas is you could keep all the outward regulations of the law, including the dietary laws, and keep them perfectly and still be unclean because your heart is not motivated toward pleasing God. He makes the point that all of these outward actions that he describes in verses 21 through 23 all originate in the heart. They all originate with hatred and envy and strife and all kinds of evil dispositions, and then that influences our actions. A lot of times our actions don't change our hearts. I can go and take food to the poor with my hands and with my body, but yet my heart despises them. I'm still unclean. And it just talks about the importance of guarding our hearts and our attitudes before God if we truly want to be clean. In Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, he says, where your heart is, that's where your treasure will be. Or we think about in Proverbs chapter 4, he said, guard your heart because from it flow these springs of water. It's just the reminder that, yes, the outward things that we do and the things we partake of are important, but what's going to truly declare us clean is our attitude and disposition toward God. I think that's the main point I take away from this and the challenge I've got. What do you see in there?
Yeah, no, I like that. I think, I don't know how much to make of this, but something that I heard a lot as a kid was, that it wasn't exactly like this, but you have to watch what kind of video games you're playing and what kind of music you're listening to and what kind of media you're consuming, because those things will, implant themselves in your heart, and that is what will come out of you. And I think there's some validity to that, Jesus says here, it's not what goes into a man. He's talking very specifically about the food, not just about what you intake is kind of going to be what your output is, right? But I also think that we can be in a situation where, we live in a world that is evil and wicked and sinful, and sometimes we can't always keep ourselves from hearing or taking in some of those wicked things. To me, I think that's what's so cool in Daniel chapter 1 that is stressed about his good character is it doesn't really say all that much about, wasn't it so cool that Daniel didn't eat of this, defiled meat or whatever. It was, Daniel said in his heart, purposed in his heart. That was what was cool about it, is that he had ahead of time made the decision that whatever goes on in Babylon, whatever I'm being tempted to do, whatever the people around me are doing, I'm making a decision right now that I'm going to live the way God wants me to. And I think to an extent, that's kind of what Jesus is talking about here as well, is that, look, we can all experience different things. The fact is that what we choose to do with our lives, that's what's important as far as our relationship with God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would give you another example to that. Think about Lot. Lot in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah, true wickedness. God calls it abominable, the practices that were engaged in. But yet the Apostle Peter described, consider righteous Lot, how his heart or soul was tormented. His heart was pure, even though he was surrounded by all these wicked things, and he didn't allow that to change his heart, and thus he spewed garbage.
Right.
I think in one maybe a distinction is made here. They would consider eating clean foods as making you clean. It's not so much, but that's not how it works. Right. It's got to first be clean here and to drive our actions. The converse may not be as true. If we take in unclean things, it can change our hearts. But just taking in clean things, actions may not cleanse us.
And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, is that just what we intake in either direction is not what the determining factor is. Because there can be, like you said, a righteous person in a wicked, sinful place that's having to endure a lot of wickedness and still chooses to be righteous. There can be wicked people who go to church and take the Lord's Supper and give their tithe and all this stuff, and they still choose to be a wicked person. And like you said, maybe that righteous person, he lets that stuff affect him a little bit too much and it starts coming out of him. Maybe that wicked person, they commit themselves enough to being in this environment, and maybe it does have a good effect on them. But I think that's what makes Jesus so cool also, is that whereas touching an unclean thing or coming in contact with an unclean thing made somebody unclean, and touching a clean thing doesn't make them clean. Jesus kind of reverses that, where he can touch the unclean, and instead of him becoming unclean, it becomes clean. I think that's really cool, is that we need Jesus to be that determining factor in our lives, that whatever we're involved in, whatever is around us in our environment, we're still going to have Christ living in us to be putting that forth.
Amen. I guess the last thought I had was on verse 23, just some of the statements of Jesus. There are evil things. Jesus doesn't mince words here. They're not just made evil or good by whether you get them in your heart. There are things that are just evil. He describes that. And partaking of evil things makes you defiled or unclean. We need to recognize that. We're not talking here in just some abstract, generic way, just some t-shirt slogan. They are things that are evil and wrong, and God describes those things as that. Whether it's evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulterers, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. Those are not insignificant things. Jesus says those are evil things. And if we participate in those, they make us unclean. That we are unclean because they are expressions of our heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's a challenging text. I hope you can stop and consider these words of Jesus, and these are preserved for us to challenge you to guard our hearts and to make sure our actions are not just mere manifestations that would be a facade to what wickedness is in our heart, but it be a true reflection of our devotion to God and our love for Him. I hope that helps you this week. I hope you have a great week. Spend more time in the Gospel of Mark and in the Bible at all. It'll be transformative in your life. I hope you all have a great week. God bless. We'll see you next week.